country. I think it's all very entangled, but every single piece of these eras are kind of really create this like all encompassing picture that I think is very important. And all, what does that have to do with climate change mitigation efforts? And really that's kind of what I'm tying it together with, right? In 2015, we have the Paris Agreement, and really we have national determined contributions targeting greenhouse gas emissions to limit global warming to at least 2 degrees Celsius. We have some principles of climate justice. We have talks about technology transfer and climate finance. And really, that's when Mexico kind of began to be in my peripheral. Because from COP21, Paris Agreement, we see a lot of headlines that were looking at Mexico for their very ambitious targets to limit greenhouse gas emissions. So environmentalists, we were very excited. We thought, well, Mexico could be a climate leader. It could set the stage for Latin American development. And if we support them enough in the right way, maybe it could be just the piece to the puzzle so that we can start seeing these changes in other developing countries. But what was really interesting actually about Mexico and that climate change mitigation era was that the progressive targets from the Paris Agreement were done by an administration who I guess could be characterized by as a centrist, right-leaning administration. And to their detriment, this actually led for very low approval ratings for this president that proposed these targets. And he left office with very bad ratings. And it also created a vacuum for a socialist president, which is what Mexico has now. And this socialist leftist president is not necessarily against climate change, but really is focusing on economic development. And that really intrigued me because why? Why is what I guess we could consider a conservative administration having progressive climate change policy when a administration that's more of a left-winging socialist president is backdropping on a lot of the global agreements. And that really kind of led me to think about neoliberalism. And is this the key and the main objective to tackle when dealing with climate change in countries like Mexico? Because neoliberalism for a lot of people could be seen as a way to greenwash some of these initiatives that are supposedly combating climate change. And I think that's a lot of the resistance that Mexico sees with climate change mitigation. And what really worries me about all of that is something that's very important to me, which is climate justice. And it's also very interesting to me to see how this plays out during COVID. Because what we're going to see is less ambitious NDCs, less ambitious goals in the face of, well, a lot of turmoil in a lot of countries. And this here on the right is a greenhouse gas emission. It is from 2019, so it would be interesting to see how this is going to change now considering 2020 and even 2021 with COVID in the background, but for me, it's all really connected, and this kind of serves as a framework of how we can develop strategies to support these countries that are disproportionately affected by climate change. And so the historical perspective for me really kind of ties together with everything that has to do with climate mitigation, right? The global cooperation, the climate justice initiatives, research even, right? When we talk about, having projects that are not only have good intent, but will be supported by local and regional organizations when we talk about economic development and of course, social equity. Climate mitigation in some is just so really complex, and the root issues really need to be centered in climate justice initiatives. When it comes to global cooperation, and technological transfers, I think social economic understanding of the region could really be the difference between successful projects and a failure. So it's really just important to interrogate kind of the perspective that we're looking at when we are creating global and international cooperation methods. And it's something that I really hope to push anytime that I have, even if you come from a background of a more science heavy field. Because that's often the burden of marginalized communities, is to really understand the status quo of who is poor and why they're poor to begin with. And so I know it's a lot, and if there's any clarification that's needed, please don't hesitate to ask, because I know that I try to squeeze so much in 10 minutes. Maybe not everything was very clear.
Thank you very much, Eva, for your presentation. And we have time for some questions, so feel free to either chat or unmute and ask a question directly. I'm curious, if you were to do this analysis in another country, whether you would find something similar, and is Mexico kind of an outlier, representative for someone that doesn't know a lot than you do? What would you answer that?
Yeah, actually, that's kind of one of my next steps. I think this general topic is something that's very interesting to me. What I anticipate being different are essentially some of the details, probably what certain historical eras would tell me about the political rhetoric, I think would be probably different. But there is a lot of similarities, I think, especially in Latin America, with the legacy of colonialism and the history of exploitation of labor and biodiversity. There's just so many similarities that I think it would definitely be an interesting add-on to this topic.
There is a comment and a question. So the comment first from Wesley: really appreciate the focus on indigenous knowledge from the Aztec Empire too. And then Matt asks, what specific resource industries do you believe Mexico would should nationalize, and how imagined they should be run? And fantastic presentation, also a comment.
Yeah, nationalization is actually something that's super interesting to me. Right now, they have the oil industry. For the most part, is nationalized. Recently, there was, I think, 17% that was privatized. But the energy sector is nationalized. The railroad system was nationalized up until 1990. But there's always that's kind of like the big argument within administrations: is privatization going to boost the economy and in turn allow us to have more environmental protections, or is this the issue that we need to get rid of, right? So I think that's probably up to people's interpretation. I think if you're an economist, you might disagree or agree that it's just mismanagement, but I think that just differs with fields of study.
Thank you for your answer. So welcome to those that showed up. If you have my name when you do show up, please change your name. I apologize for my wrong Zoom link that I sent. Welcome, Professor Chapela. Selena Melgoza is next, and I hope I didn't completely butcher your name. And if I did, please tell me how to pronounce it well. You try doing my last name and then we're even. So Selena, you have the floor, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Great. Okay, I hope you all can see that. And so, hello, everybody. I am Selena. I am a senior now studying society environment with a minor in public policy. And today I'll be presenting to you my CNR honors thesis on the topic of analyzing intersectional policy through Milwaukee's declaration of racism as a public health crisis. So first off, putting Milwaukee's declaration into context. In 2018, the Wisconsin Public Health Association had declared racism as a public health crisis. And following their public health declaration, they established a racial equity working group that was set to meet the demands the resolution called for. A year later, the county of Milwaukee was actually the first county in the United States to declare racism as a public health crisis. And soon after, in April of 2019, the city of Milwaukee adopted the declaration as well. And this makes Milwaukee's city, county, and public health association to be the first ones to adopt this declaration, setting racism as a public health crisis. So in my research, I was really interested in analyzing this new framework of racism as a public health crisis and using Milwaukee as a primary example and using the pandemic as an example, as well as the American Medical Association's similar declaration as a subcase. I went through a literature review of environmental justice theory and analyzed Milwaukee's declaration along with AMA's declaration. And to do so, I conducted several interviews with people who were directly involved in creating the declarations. And this included county members, council members, and department members, including delegates of AMA as well. And secondly, I interviewed community members and organizations in Milwaukee specifically who were involved in environmental or anti-racism organization work in Milwaukee. And so in the interviews, here's just a sample of my interview questions for the creators of the declarations. And essentially all the interviews, the goal was to understand what was the impetus for this declaration. Was it internal or internally driven, or were community members involved? How expansive was this declaration? Was it able to tackle issues that were social, environmental, health-wise, or sustainable-wise? Additionally, we asked what were the impacts of this declaration? What happened after this declaration was made? Did it aid in the pandemic? And those kinds of things. In my second set of interviews with the community members, I asked them if they knew about the declaration. Were they involved in the creation of the declaration? If they saw this declaration being impactful? And asked them what their perspective was. Was this symbolic or actionable? And through these interviews, I gained a huge context for Milwaukee's social challenges, and that really made me understand further why Milwaukee was making such a declaration. And just to put this into context, to this day, according to 2019 statistics, a white person lives on average nearly 14 years longer than a Black person in Milwaukee. And in interviews, council members and community members have described the disparities as such. And on the slide, I have a few quotes for you. Marciela Nicholson, who I interviewed, is a council member, and she pointed to the mass incarceration that's happening in Wisconsin. 50% of Black men who come from the zip code that I grew up in have been touched by the incarceration system at the end of their lives at some point. And as a whole, Milwaukee incarcerates more folks in the state of Wisconsin than the entire nation. And if you know, the United States itself is the largest global incarcerator. And to put that perspective in our nation, Wisconsin is driving a large amount of those incarceration rates. And Reggie Jackson, who was actually hired as a part of this declaration to be the equity advisor and trainer for the employees, described Milwaukee as Milwaukee is considered the worst place to live in the United States if you're Black. It's the worst place to raise a Black family. And I point this out because it's just to put in context the kind of social challenges that Milwaukee is experiencing and what is driving this, this declaration. And now, looking at the impact of the declaration, Milwaukee was one of the very first cities and counties to recognize the racial disparities between who is dying from the COVID-19 pandemic. And this was even earlier than the United States government had released and earlier than the CDC. And that just goes to point that having this kind of racial conscious policies allow them to address racial issues faster. Additionally, the city of Milwaukee established an ordinance which was to institutionalize racial equity. And in this, they trained over 4,000 employees on racial equity. And this promoted the acknowledgement of racism as an issue because that was something that has not been normalized in Wisconsin, although there were many lived experiences to show. They established Public Health Week as a yearly form of education to happen within the community. They created an ambassadors program, as well as a racial equity budget tool and audit committee. And these are very important because there are other ways other than the declaration to institutionalize racial equity practices within the city. And now looking at this, them being the first, there are now 146 jurisdictions and 28 states that have made this declaration. So we can see that this bottom-up approach of starting policy and local politics actually has a large effect and is spanning over the nation. And so with this, there are a number of challenges in Milwaukee's declaration. And after these interviews, I learned about these things. And starting from the top, I learned a lot about the importance of having community members and organizations being on the table and developing this language for declarations. So in specific for the county, there was minimal community involvement. It was more of county representatives coming together and then making this declaration. In contrast, the city of Milwaukee was more in community involved. And this is important because we can see that the city of Milwaukee's declaration and their following actions were a lot more progressive than the county because of that community involvement. Additionally, the county declaration is voluntary. So cities, a part of Milwaukee and Wisconsin, do not necessarily have to adopt this declaration. And that means that areas that may need it the most, including the suburbs, which are wealthier and wider, may not have the same urgency to adopt these kinds of resolutions, even though they may be needed in those areas the most. Additionally, there was a lot of challenges with using the term racism and race. These conversations were not normalized, and people from different backgrounds were coming to these equity trainings with Reggie Jackson and not being comfortable because they were saying, I am not a racist. And that is in fact a part of the larger problem of normalizing these discussions. And I think it's very important to have these conversations normalized because it allows for better policy. Another large challenge that we've seen is more structural, and that is in regards to the county and the city budget. So the city of Milwaukee has actually been struggling financially as their shared revenue has been declining between 30 to 40 million, which means every year that they're actually already in a deficit. And that makes advocating for budgets to be into racial equity are harder to do so. And then with the county, it's a little harder too because their budget is still largely tied to the police budget. So community members are asking if this racial equity is serious if they're not actually readdressing their budget to allocate for these services. And I'll touch briefly on the American Medical's resolution. And this came from delegates who are actually current students of color and a part of AMA. And they decided to make this resolution to hold AMA accountable. And the reason why I wanted to look at this is because AMA is actually the largest physician organization, and they passed this resolution in November of 2020. And with all of this, I know it's a lot, I'm talking very fast, there's so much to say. The key findings are that having representative leadership and leadership of color promotes race-conscious policies. In the city of Milwaukee, all 5 major council positions were held by Black people, and 4 out of 5 of them were Black women. And that directly translates to the amount of progressive policies in addressing these racial issues that are present in Milwaukee. Additionally, declarations are a strong starting point to promoting accountability and promoting racial equity. There are still structural challenges. However, we've seen with the city of Milwaukee, ordinance in addition to the declaration have a lot more teeth and are a lot more proactive. Additionally, the voluntary adoption allows for easier passage at the county level, but it does have less teeth in terms of actually promoting racial equity. By looking at budgets, you can see that there's a large scope for feasible systemic change. And lastly, through the interviews, we've seen that the perceptions of the declarations are kind of split. Community members are those who are not involved in the process, seeing these declarations as more performative than actionable, whereas the council members see these as good wins and a step in the right direction for actions. For those who may be looking to do this in the future, some recommendations I wanted to put forward was working to build alliances and partnerships with other organizations that are already doing this work. It's important to work with them and use their language and be responsive to their demands in promoting local or countywide policies. Additionally, at the county level, consider requiring entities to adopt the declaration as a requirement rather than voluntary to extend its reach. And additionally, in the last one, to ensure the declarations are action-oriented rather than symbolic. And I think this goes along with the lines of ensuring that there are ordinances or policies that follow declarations to ensure that racial equity is being pushed forward. And then lastly, in my last few seconds, some concluding statements is that I think that this declaration process has a great opportunity to spur systematic change, and especially in the time that we're all experiencing now. It has an ability to influence environmental justice policies by using a public health framework to push those policies forward. And the biggest thing here is defining a problem impacts how you respond to a problem, and calling racism out for what it is what is needed to make solutions. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Shalina. Don't unmute because I hope we have some questions from the audience and the attendees. I'm curious, how did you do the interviews? Was it online or did you send surveys? How did you sample who you're interviewing?
Yeah, I actually was able to meet with everybody via Zoom. And that was actually a great experience. I was actually hoping to be in Milwaukee and do this research. But it was fortunate enough that we have Zoom set up, and I was able to meet with everyone via Zoom. And then just was able to record and transcribe and then collect all of this data.
Well, we are very thankful you did this and shedding light into ways to highlight it through a lens that is being implemented. It's always very helpful to start the conversations and the solutions, as you say. Well done, Selena. And we are gonna go now to, if Mari's ready, to Mari Wilson. And I hope I said your name correctly. If I didn't, please correct me.
You did, yeah.
And Mari, you have the floor, and then we will stop for a break and come back. But Mari, you have plenty of time because we're running ahead of schedule, so no need to rush and just enjoy.
Oh, great. Okay, thank you. All right, well, my name is Mari Wilson. I'm in the PMB department, and my wonderful advisor, Claudia Carr, is in the S1 department. And my honors thesis project was on river basin development, and I'm using the Turkwell Dam in northwestern Kenya as a case study. So this is like a brief introduction to my project. The problems with huge dam projects are fairly well known and fairly well researched. And so knowing these problems can kind of drive developers to opt for medium or smaller scale dams, kind of with the idea that this will be able to circumvent some of those issues that arise. But this kind of led me to ask the question of, are these medium scale dams in particular actually better than large scale dams? Are they a viable alternative? And as it turns out, there's really relatively little research that surveys medium scale dams as a whole to answer this question. So I began in Kenya here. You can see the picture of the Turkwell River on the left, and then there's a riverine forest around it. So I began here in Kenya with this river to see if the rhetoric around medium dams kind of matches the reality of this project, and then seeing if this can be applied to medium scale dam development as a whole. And so moving forward, I'm going to be giving some context on this dam project and then systematically going through its effects. And in the end, you will see that it is quite emblematic of development projects as a whole. So this here is a satellite image of the river. And up on the left, this is just situating you. Here's Kenya. This is the region we're looking in kind of in the red. Right here is the border between Kenya and Uganda. And the river rises in Mount Elgon, which is right on the border, and it flows northeast. So here it flows, this is actually the upstream portion through West Pokot County. I'm sorry about the noise. And this here is the Turkwell Gorge, and the dam is sited right here. And then it continues flowing northeast through Turkana County, where the Turkana live, in this very arid region, and it lets out into Lake Turkana. And just to give you a bit of like a size reference, Lake Turkana is huge. It's probably, I think it's the largest permanent desert lake in the world. So it does make the Turkwell Gorge Dam Reservoir here look very small, but it's really not an insubstantial amount of water. And I will show you that very soon. But first, we're just going to go over the livelihoods of the people that I just mentioned, which are the Turkana and the Pokot. So the Turkana are the downstream pastoralists living in that extremely arid region that I just mentioned. And the Pokot are the upstream pastoralists. And as you saw, it was a little bit greener there. So they practice some kind of like agro-pastoralism, but it's really not a huge amount of their livelihood. So the critical context I want you to have before I jump into the dam is how these people have lived and how vulnerability has been generated throughout the 1900s by the British colonial regime in Kenya. And the three major examples of how this arose is through, firstly, the restriction of movements. And movement is an extremely important part of a pastoralist livelihood. So by restricting these movements, by not allowing them near the river and the forest, they kind of undermined their livelihood and coping strategies. Others were taxation and also confiscation of animals, which is just kind of directly attacking their resource base. So in the 60s, 70s, and the 80s, there were these droughts, and many people were pushed into famine camps. But the unique thing, as I said here, is that this is a very drought-prone region, and they have historically been able to be resilient to it. But paired with this generation of vulnerability, it became a very serious issue. So the government solution was by providing food relief and then kind of discouraging pastoralism, trying to promote irrigation and settle pastoralists. So keeping that in mind, I'm going to jump into the Turkwell Gorge Multipurpose Hydroelectric Dam project. This is an image of it on the left. This here is the thin arch concrete dam. It's about 153 meters tall. That's like a little over 400 feet. This here is the reservoir. It's about 6,500 hectares. It's pretty large. It was built from 1986 to 1991. And so the history behind it is that the Kenyan government, most notably the then Minister of Energy, Nicholas Biwott, were involved with the inception of this idea along with France. And so the two main purposes of this dam is power generation, because it's a hydroelectric dam, and secondly, irrigation schemes. Although in reality, I think these irrigation schemes were more about social control, because Biwott himself said that he hoped that the dam would help the donkey, which is the pastoralist, catch up with the horse, which are people in kind of more developed regions of the country. And the second thing is that NORAD undertook the first feasibility study of this dam. And what was really interesting and kind of unique actually to this project is that they advised against it. They said it was non-viable. It was located on two fault lines. It would rapidly silt up and it would destroy the downstream forest. But the Kenyan government, with Biwott pushing for it, moved forward with this project anyway. In the end, this dam cost 3 times what it should have, about $300 million US dollars. And it was contracted to Sogrea as the engineer and SPIE as the consultant. And these are both French firms. So Biwott then flew to Paris and signed this contract in secret in a hotel room, although he denies it. And much of this information was given to us because this EU delegate named Ashim Kratz leaked a memorandum to the London Times that stated that the Turkwell Dam was shockingly overpriced. It was financed on commercial loans, despite offers for more concessionary loans. And he said, and I will just quote, that the French deal was only made possible because of handsome profits for French executives involved and handsome kickbacks for their Kenyan counterparts. And this includes millions of dollars to Biwott and the then president, Daniel Arap Moi. So despite their best efforts, this news got out. And in Kenya, this project is known as a stinking scandal and the whitest of white elephants, which is a phrase for scandalous and corrupt. So it's really safe to say that from the inception of this project, there's only interest in power generation and monetary gain, and there was really very little thought given to the people living near the actual dam site. So now I'm just going to overview the outcomes of this Turkwell Gorge project and see, did it actually even live up to its purported goals? The irrigation schemes have mostly failed. They lack water, there are pest outbreaks, and they have really not been able to provide food security in the region whatsoever. Secondly, when it comes to electrification, within the first few years of construction, one of the turbines actually broke. So for years, it was only operating at most half capacity. Even so, it has almost never been full, and many people say it was very well known that there just was not enough water on this river to make it viable to actually generate the 106 megawatts that they wanted to connect to the national grid. Of course, none of this power has ever gone to the locals, although there's money being poured into a rural electrification program. They have not seen even a single megawatt really in the region. But the other thing is that a lot of locals don't necessarily need power, they need land and a resource base. And even this is being undermined because we're seeing conflict rising in the area with rising cattle rustling, serious environmental degradation as was predicted, rivering forest disruption, decreased groundwater because there's less flooding to recharge, invasive species, and sedimentation and siltation. Also, their welfare is directly being undermined, as again has been seen in many dam projects and irrigation schemes. There's a huge increase in waterborne diseases and also crocodile attacks. There's been a loss of tradition, social networks and ties. So once a lot of pastoralists do try to settle here, they've lost their social ties and networks. So it makes it much harder to ever transition back into other lifestyles. There's also a current overflow crisis that I will touch on in a moment. And there's also ongoing oil speculation that may become another abstraction point for the water in this dam. So this is a very current issue. This might be a bit confusing because I did say that the dam almost never reached its full capacity, but in recent years it has gotten fuller. This is partially due to geological factors and because siltation is increasing, the overall capacity of the dam has decreased, and this is also paired with heavy rains. So a 2019 dam report showed, and this is across dams of the country, it showed that the dams have almost never been inspected or maintained. The county themselves publicly stated that they cannot find the emergency contingency plan that should have been created when this dam was constructed, if it had ever been created at all. There's no alarm system in the region, so there's really no way to alert people. And also 300,000 or more people are at risk of dying when this dam overflows. And you can see, I mean, the perspective might be hard, but this is only a few meters before it will overtop. So this is a very serious crisis that arose in 2020 and it's ongoing. So now I'm just going to go over my concluding remarks. Firstly, on the topic of the Turkwell Dam, the main theory here is that it is a corrupt undertaking. It did not circumvent many of the issues that arise with large-scale dams. It has many of the same negative impacts on livelihoods and on the environment. It has not really achieved much of its goals. To give some concession, I believe it has generated some electricity, but it is not as much as they had hoped. And then to answer the original question of dam development as a whole, medium-scale dams can be extremely dangerous. They do not necessarily or even remotely inherently avoid any problems that large-scale dams have. They're not a safe or viable alternative to be investing in. And many other medium-scale dams share these flaws. So I think the Turkwell can be taken as a jumping off point and an emblem of medium-scale dam development. And then the final framework that has kind of guided me through this and that my professor just drove home in one of her classes that really changed my life and how I viewed things was thinking of development of what, towards what, and for whom. And that is how I have approached this project, considering how different people would answer this question. And this is something that I kind of want to leave everybody else with when it comes to just interrogating how development works and if it is viable. So with that, I just want to thank everyone. Thank you guys for hosting this symposium and thank my professor for being so wonderful.
And your professor is here, so she can congratulate herself. Claudia, are you there? Anyway, well done, Mari. And we have time for some questions, and then we'll just break for oh, there she is. Woohoo! We cannot hear what you're saying.
I don't think you're on mute, Claudia, but I think there might be an issue with the microphone.
You are worth the wait, Claudia, don't worry.
If we want, in the meantime, there is a question in the chat.
Oh,
are you ready, Claudia?
Patricia is asking, what about medium scale dams makes them dangerous? And then Claudia, you can take the floor.
Okay, hi Patricia. Well, the main things that make them dangerous, they kind of operate on many levels. The first one is it's not less likely to have an overflow crisis. So it can still endanger, especially in this case, 300,000 people downstream. And even though it's technically a smaller dam, it's still 420 feet tall. And if it breaks in a narrow gorge, it can shoot downstream and easily kill people. Other problems with that is there's this kind of false idea that it's going to provide food security. So by settling pastoralists, you're kind of undermining any alternative lifestyles that they could have. And then by failing to provide that food security, it just leads to food relief and destitution. And on top of that, having so much standing water in the region can seriously increase cases of malaria and any other waterborne diseases, which is being shown. And because, it's not just that it's medium scale, it's that it's this really non-directed form of development that does not focus on or consider any people living downstream. And when you do that, even with a medium scale dam, it's still seriously harmful. So I guess that's my general answer. Claudia, for your question.
Can you hear me now by chance?
Oh, yes, we can.
Oh, God. Okay, I'm sorry. I've been having audio problems all morning. So, Mari, congratulations. Really lovely presentation. I knew this would pull things together. It was wonderful. I do have a question, which is, I know you're going to go on with this kind of work, and it really is frontier work. And I really mean that for Southeast Asia and Latin America and Africa. This work has not really been done before. And I'm wondering how do you actually something I haven't had a chance to ask you is, how do you actually see what you need to know next for this kind of thing? I presume it might be in the downstream area, or how are you viewing that in terms of what's next?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that feels most important to me, because I'm focusing on livelihoods in a large part of that downstream region, is actually talking to people. I feel that a lot of what I'm getting from this is kind of like secondhand through reports, and like part of why I took this on is wanting to interact. So
Right.
COVID has made that difficult, but going forward, I would really love to be able to actually interview people and hear what their firsthand experiences are with the project.
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine that the government is still going to say this is a positive experiment, because it was too embarrassing for them to not do that, right? So that really means you'd need some hard evidence in terms of, is it hurting people, is it helping them, et cetera, presumably downstream then, you're saying?
Yeah, I think also to some extent upstream, because I think like around the actual gorge site is where the Poco are. And they actually have had some serious impacts as well, but mostly downstream.
So those would be the Pokot people upstream, which are both agricultural and pastoral, and then the pastoral is being settled downstream.
Yeah.
Right. That's great. I mean, this will be, honestly, I can guarantee you, working in this area in other regions, the officials in this region will be extremely interested in this data. They will be very interested.
Good. I hope so.
Thank you, Claudia. We have an announcement to make.
I just wanted to congratulate Mari on the GPB major citation. She is the GPB major citation winner, as she knows. So congratulations on that. You're the best.
Oh,
Literally.
Wonderful.
Literally, you're the best.
Oh, thank you so much.
Whoa, how wonderful.
Congratulations. So we're gonna make a short break.
I think we also have one other question.
We have one question. Never mind. Apologies.
Matt had asked, how is the current administration approach to tackling the oncoming overflow crisis?
Well, unfortunately, they don't really have much of an approach. I was looking through kind of like what their announcements had been. I saw the one that I talked to you guys about, where they basically said they don't have the emergency contingency plan. There also is no alarm system. Like, there's just really no effective way to even warn people. And the other thing is that even if you do warn people, like, where are they going to go? Like, this is a very flat, wide area. A lot of these people are tied to their irrigation schemes, as I told you, and mobility has just inherently been decreased, which was one of their survival strategies. So even if they can come up with a plan, it's very hard for them to actually implement it effectively. When it comes to contingency plans, they did contract with the Kenyan Red Cross, and they came up with some semblance of a plan and analysis of the situation. So they have something, but it's really not as much as what needs to happen, because this is still a very, very serious life-threatening crisis, and preventable in some ways. Long in the past, this was known that this could have happened, which is what makes it so sad. But yeah, I guess the sad answer is not enough.
Great.
Are there any other questions? Okay, we can take a break.
That's it. Great. Thank you so much.
All right.
And I suppose, should I go? Will you let me know when? Or?
I will ask Anna to introduce you, if that's okay.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah, so next we have Ariel. Is it Pouch?
Pouch. Yeah.
Pouch. Okay, great.
Yeah, thank you. So my name is Ariel, and my thesis project is titled When Nature Talks Back, Science, Fantasy, and Rationalism in the Alice books of Lewis Carroll and Margaret Boyson. And so for some background on where I'm coming from with this, because it takes a slightly different form as a thesis, my project explores the ways that language and storytelling relate to science, particularly thinking about how we collectively make sense of uncertainty and doubt. And I'm drawing inspiration from the many disciplinary crossing possibilities and rabbit holes offered by the environmental humanities, weaving together the study of literature, eco-criticism, and the history of science. I begin with the premise that science, like literature, is a historically, culturally, and materially situated way of producing collective knowledge. And I'm interested in how we can think about this, particularly as it concerns ecological and environmental questions, the ways of knowing and living in the world specific to different people, times, and environments, and how we think about nature and our place in it. So, how do you move slides? So, looking at 2 stories for or about children, Lewis Carroll's 19th century Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, together with his original manuscript and his own drawings, and from the 20th century, Margaret Boyson's Alice, the Zeta Cat, and Climate Change, I'm exploring how fantasy is in dialogue with science. What might nonsense have to say about the particular and historically situated ways we make sense of the world? How do the alternative worlds we imagine through storytelling reflect our understandings of truth and reality and perhaps provoke new ones? Particularly, I'm interested in how these fantasies might challenge a mechanistic view of nature and instead imagine the world around us, its ecology, to be vital, animate, and alive. I found that what's most moving about these stories is the way they personify and ascribe agency to beings that have traditionally been imagined to be inert or unthinking, and particularly in the wake of scientific discoveries, which also challenge such binaries. For Carroll, the theory of evolution by natural selection, and for Boyson, the study of anthropogenic climate change. So I begin with a passage from Through the Looking Glass. The time has come, the walrus said, to talk of many things, of shoes and ships and sealing wax, of cabbages and kings, and why the sea is boiling hot and whether pigs have wings. The humor of Lewis Carroll, which has given many child and adult readers so much amusement, is centered around the proliferation of possibility and the mutation of common logic. It is not just about walruses that talk, but about seeing the world contrary-wise, as if through a mirror or underground. Experience and reason tell us that the sea is not boiling hot and pigs, as of yet, do not have wings, but Alice's dream suggests otherwise. She is continually made aware of just how irrational the inhabitants of Wonderland and the Looking Glass world seem. She is confronted by puns and other mutations of common language, as well as monstrous and hybrid creatures, animals that speak like adult humans, often taking themselves far too seriously, playing cards, chess pieces, and other inanimate objects that come alive and talk back. Charles Dodgson, who is better known by his pseudonym Lewis Carroll, was an Oxford mathematician, and as such was aware and perhaps a participant in the uproar over the publication of Charles Darwin's theories. Wonderland was published only 6 years after The Origin of Species, and Looking Glass was published later in the same year as The Descent of Man. In this context, we might reimagine all of the lively creatures, mutations, and metamorphoses in the Alice books and see how Alice herself is implicated in this lively order when she swims in a primordial sea of tears with all of the other birds and beasts following her, and when she grows and shrinks unexpectedly as she moves through her environment and must come to terms with that she is perhaps not the omniscient creator of her dreams, but rather a bewildered participant in its ecology. Meaning and truth themselves are dynamic, as are the rules of language unbound in Carroll's evolutionary game. So literature here intervenes in scientific debate and contributes to our imagination of evolution as something random rather than logical, of possibility and unpredictability rather than fixity, making the world seem animate and alive, no longer mechanistic. When Darwin published his theories of evolution by natural selection, the idea that humans shared a common ancestor with all other living things, that species did not exist in a fixed hierarchy, caused distinctions between human and non-human, thinking and non-thinking, natural and man-made, to fall apart. As Alice says, you've no idea how confusing it is, all the things being alive. Curiouser and curiouser, these are some of the same ideas that scholars across the humanities and sciences are discussing now in the context of anthropogenic climate change, when the concept of the Anthropocene, of humans acting as geological agents, is prompting us to scale up our imagination of the human, as historian Dipesh Chakrabarty says. 150 years after Carroll's nonsense verse was first published, the walrus's talk of why the sea is boiling hot takes on a new register. As readers in 2021, in a world where the oceans are warming and acidifying at a frightening pace, what was once nonsense or seeming impossibility comes to bear on reality. Margaret Boysen, a trained geologist and the current director of the Artist in Residence program at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, reimagines Carol's walrus in the era of climate change. In fact, she has taken the whole frame of Alice in Wonderland and rewritten the famous nonsense narrative as an allegory for the way that climate research functions. In Alice, the Zeta Cat and Climate Change, published by the Potsdam Institute's Arts Initiative in 2016, Alice does not fall down a rabbit hole, but instead falls down the ventilation shaft of a supercomputer. She does not pass through a mirror into a looking glass world, but instead enters a climate model through the screen. Inside the climate model, she meets a cast of characters, including a pig with wings and an arithmetic society of nobles, who are personifications of the model's mathematical functions and metaphors for Earth systems processes. So what I have been doing is looking at these two stories and seeing how they are in dialogue with the scientific discoveries and practices of their times. And this is, of course, much more explicit in Boysen's Alice than in the original, where evolution always lies just below the surface. But like Carol's Alice books, Zeta Cat is a story about what a child can know and come to know, an allegory for dealing with the proliferating uncertainties and contradictions of growing up as a logical creature in an unruly and unpredictable world system. In Boysen's book, animals, flowers, and snowflakes talk because they are representatives within a climate model meant to educate the human Alice about the causes and effects of anthropogenic climate change. Both authors, who inhabit a creative space between fiction and mathematics, show that uncertainty is fundamental to science, but also the imagining of alternative worlds in the future. In a time when the fate of the planet seems intimately entangled with what is possible for humans to imagine, fiction plays a critical role in how we make sense of uncertainty, what stories we tell children and what stories we tell about children are intimately entangled with our imagination of the future and what is possible. It is not just about communicating scientific knowledge of some sort of objective truth, but also about recognizing how science is a way of knowing particular to humans in particular times, and is situated within the language and metaphors we use to understand the world. And I would just like to end by saying how incredibly grateful I am for the help of Professor Turner and Professor Chapella, without whose patience and support and good humor, this project would not have been possible or nearly as fun. And also thank you to the college for making this kind of research possible for undergraduates, and for undergraduates to do work across departments is really such a gift. So thank you.
Well done, Ariel. Congratulations on honors from CNR. And I would like to open the floor for some questions. Feel free to unmute and ask the question directly.
Thank you, Ariel, for your presentation. It was a really lovely presentation. Really enjoyed it. I'm just curious, would you be willing to share like what inspired this for your honors thesis and tell us a little bit of just like the development of working on this?
Yeah. So really this was inspired by a series of coincidences. I think through the conservation and resource studies major, I've designed my area of interest around the history of science and our imagination. It's a word that comes up a lot for me, but our imagination of nature and ourselves as a part of it. And I was really interested, I still am very interested in the history of botany and Linnaean classification. And I had gone to Uppsala in Sweden, where the Linnaean gardens are. And I was reading about how some theories that Lewis Carroll's work was inspired by Linnaeus in part, all of this sort of naming and people asking Alice if she's animal, vegetable, or mineral. And I just thought that was really fun. I'm also interested in children's literature and childcare. And then I was at a lecture at Uppsala University by Kevin Anderson and Isaac Stoddard, who work on climate change, and they were quoting Alice in their lecture on the Paris Agreement, and there were just all these strange coincidences leading me to want to do a project about Alice specifically and try to think about it across time and how is botanical classification, and then I found evolution related to also what we're thinking about climate change now. And finding Margaret Boyson's book was really such an amazing coincidence and gift that she also is thinking about such things and tried to repurpose Alice to communicate climate science, but also think about how climate science has produced and sort of humanized that process. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you so much.
That was really lovely. Someone says, thank you so much, but this kind person is listed as me, so I'm not taking the credit. If you at some point tell me who you are, I'll change your name. Well done, Ariel. And to keep us on schedule, I will ask, please, Cam, to take the floor and present your work.
Thank you. I'll share my screen now.
Oh, it's Maggie. Were you the one that were nice? Okay.
So good afternoon. I'll jump right into it. This is my research presentation on analyzing uneven vulnerability to urban heat islands using GIS-based techniques, and I focused on Oakland, California. My name is Cam, and I am a conservation and resource studies student, and my faculty mentors for this project are Maggie Kelly and Charisma AC. Before I get into my research, I wanted to start with my motivations for pursuing this project. As a CRS student, I was able to design my coursework to pull from these three fields: city planning, environmental science, and public health. Throughout my undergraduate education, I have developed a passion for researching and understanding environmental problems that lie at the intersection of these three fields, and specifically for approaching these problems through an environmental justice framework to get a better understanding of the social context these environmental issues are rooted in. For my research project, I studied the issue of urban heat islands in Oakland, California. For those of you who are unaware of the term, urban heat islands refers to the disproportionate rise in temperatures in urban areas due to the retention of heat by impervious surfaces, buildings, and other urban materials. This is an increasingly growing problem due to three key factors. The first is a rapidly growing urban population. Currently, 80% of the United States resides in urban areas, with that percentage expected to grow, making the effects of urban heat islands more widely experienced. The second factor is climate change, which threatens a temperature increase of 2.5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit globally, further fueling urban heat islands. And lastly, historical redlining practices intentionally clustered low-income minority populations, and due to continued disinvestment of these communities, they are now at the front line of today's environmental climate threats. The image here shows the red line map of the East Bay area from 1935. This brings me to my research question and objectives. My driving question for this research project was, how can spatial modeling of urban heat island vulnerability better encompass the wide range of vulnerability factors defined across varying fields? The first half of my project was an extensive literature review, and what I found is much of vulnerability mapping of urban heat largely focuses on the physical occurrence of heat and some social demographic factors. However, the literature also describes other factors that increase vulnerability to urban heat as well, but these are often excluded from the GIS portion of research, which brings us to my project. The objectives of my research are to analyze the occurrence of urban heat islands in Oakland, assess varying vulnerability to urban heat islands based on different aspects, and identify areas most suitable for intervention. My methods for this project came in two parts, the first being a literature review, as I mentioned previously, and the second being a GIS analysis performed in ArcGIS Pro. This flowchart shows the data sources I use in my analysis process to produce the 6 figures I'll be sharing today. As I mentioned earlier, urban heat islands are largely caused by the replacement of vegetated surfaces with impervious urban materials with lower albedos, which allows them to absorb, store, and release more heat energy. This chart shows the relationship between the two maps to the right, mean land surface temperature and percent vegetation cover. Both of these maps were calculated using a USGS Landsat 8 image and aggregated at the census tract level. As seen, there's a very strong correlation between observed land surface temperature and vegetation cover, which is why urban parks and vegetation are the most common solutions to address urban heat. However, before implementing vegetation cover as a solution, it is necessary to examine vulnerability to this issue. The first type of vulnerability I analyzed is social vulnerability. This layer is based on the social determinants of health literature, which refers to social and economic factors that affect a wide range of health, functioning, and quality of life outcomes and risks. The inputs of this layer are listed here and include income, poverty, age, educational attainment, race, and language barriers. This map, along with the rest of the vulnerability maps I will be sharing, is aggregated at the census tract level and displayed using z-scores, which shows standard deviations from the city average. Positive values represent more vulnerable census tracts and negative values represent less vulnerable tracts. I'd like to draw your attention to the dark red census tracts in the middle of the map, which shows a clustering pattern of vulnerability with similar boundaries to the redlining map I showed earlier. The next aspect of vulnerability I analyze is health factors vulnerability. This layer shows health conditions and the factors contributing to these health conditions using data from Cal EnviroScreen. Based on my literature review, I found that various underlying health conditions can increase an individual's susceptibility to heat-related illnesses associated with urban heat islands. The inputs of this layer include asthma rates, cardiovascular health condition rates, diesel particulate matter emissions, and toxic release emissions. The most vulnerable tracts based on this layer are clustered around industrial sites and truck highway routes, which produce harmful emissions. The third aspect of vulnerability I analyzed is adaptive capacity vulnerability. This refers to an individual's ability to respond to environmental threats and alter their local environments to cope with these problems. This layer was the hardest to gather data for, as there are many nuanced microfactors that can contribute to an individual's adaptive capacity in regards to urban heat. These include, but are not limited to, having fans or air conditioning units, or even considering electric bill rates as an indicator of a household's ability to afford using their AC unit, even if it is available. With that being said, the inputs of this layer I was able to include are traffic density, distance to public cooling centers, car ownership, and the year homes were built as an indicator of air conditioning, as AC units were included in home construction after 1950. The data in this map is the least clustered of the three vulnerability maps, showing that areas of low adaptive capacity can be found all throughout Oakland. After defining these three aspects of vulnerability, I calculated total vulnerability to urban heat by combining the three layers. This brings me to my main findings, the total vulnerability map. This map offers a much more comprehensive view of urban heat island vulnerability rather than solely showing the occurrence of urban heat or just social factors. The two census tracts outlined in white in the map represent the neighborhoods most vulnerable to urban heat. These were identified by querying the tracts that are in the 90th percentile for both land surface temperature and total vulnerability. The first tract listed is in the Fruitvale neighborhood, and the second tract is at the edge of East Oakland, bordering San Leandro. These are the areas where interventions would be most impactful in addressing urban heat islands for the communities that are most vulnerable to them. However, when addressing urban heat islands for these vulnerable communities, the standard intervention of urban parks and vegetation could be more harmful than beneficial. The scatter plot diagram here shows the relationship between vegetation cover and mean income, which has a very strong correlation. This is due to a process known as environmental gentrification, where greening efforts lead to the displacement of the low-income communities they are implemented in. This creates the idea of the sustainability class, the idea that sustainability has to be bought and is only accessible to those who can afford it. As I strongly believe sustainability should not come with a price tag, I want to introduce an alternative solution to avoid this negative outcome, the just green enough solution. This is a planning practice that focuses on social justice and works with communities to identify their goals and come up with solutions that would allow these communities to remain in place after environmental greening efforts. Since there are no clear and easy solutions to this problem, there is currently a lot of research in this area, and this would be the next phase in this research project. Now that I have identified the most vulnerable communities, the next step would be researching how to design and implement green spaces that address urban heat islands while mitigating the potential for gentrification. Looking towards the future, I am proud to announce that I will be continuing my education as a Master of City Planning student at Berkeley, where I hope to continue researching problems at the intersection of environmental science and city planning, and potentially even furthering this research project. I would like to say a huge thank you to the CNR Honors Department for allowing me this opportunity, and a massive thank you to my mentors, Maggie Kelly and Charisma AC, for all the mentorship and help they provided me with this past year. Thank you.
Yay, we get to keep you. Congratulations, Cam. Hi, Maggie. I have a quick question, and then did you ever think about, you have census tract information. Did you ever think about not just looking at income, but other demographic characteristics of that correlation map? I'm just curious, other socioeconomic characteristics would be really interesting, and not just in a graph, maybe in a multivariate like regression setting, because you have very interesting mapping across these census tracts. So it's very micro. It's very interesting to find not just the marginal correlation, but correlated with more factors together as part of a, a joint analysis.
Yeah, so all of these inputs here are all from census data, and they give a more complete understanding of demographic information that are included within social determinants of health literature. The reason I only included a chart comparing mean income to vegetation cover is that mean income is the best indicator showing environmental gentrification. It made my point the best. In my full paper, though, I will include in the appendix more of these similar maps showing the relationship between both heat and vegetation cover to the rest of the variables.
Yeah, I was urging you not to just do individual graphs for each one, but
Oh.
put them all together. So you say, when we control for income, how is this related to something else? Just a thought, but well done.
Thank you.
Charisma and Maggie, do you have any questions that you would like to ask?
Yeah, well, first I want to congratulate Cam on an excellent project. He's worked so hard over a year, and it's just been amazing to work with him, and not surprising that he'll be starting graduate school this fall. And Kim, I was wondering if you could talk about some of the factors that lead to displacement. Maybe elaborate a bit more on environmental gentrification and perhaps some, I know that's the next phase of your review, but examples of just green enough strategies.
Yeah, so there's a lot of debate around whether greenery is causing gentrification or if it's just a factor in the process of gentrification. But the fact of the matter is that when you have parks and more green space and trees, neighborhoods become more desirable. And that goes for bike lanes and protected infrastructure and any public investment. And it makes neighborhoods more desirable, which allows homeowners and property owners to raise their rent prices and just make the area more expensive, which often drives out the existing communities. And then for examples of just green enough, the one shown here was actually done by I don't know if it was by Jennifer Walsh in CED or one of her students, but it's an example is showing how you can implement green spaces in sort of the cracks of the urban fabric. So this is a...
Right. So Anna.
Yeah, so we're going to take a break and then we'll have 4 more presenters after we come back in about 15 minutes.
Train track, and it's just putting in native plants and vegetation in a way that's not really changing the landscape in a large extent, but a lot of smaller interventions that can add up and really solve the problem without bringing in this investment that causes gentrification.
Thank you.
I would just like to say, lovely job, Cam, and nice to see you, Charisma, too, and Sophia. It's lovely to see everybody. Great job. Back to center spotlight where it needs to go. Back to you, Cam. I would like you to just comment on your design sense. You're a fantastic cartographer and design. You pay a lot of attention to design. Where did you get that from, and how do you think about this when you weave maps into a story?
Yeah, so I got passionate about cartography and mapping and design in general after taking my first GIS class, and it was required for my other simultaneous degree, but it inspired me to pick up the GIS minor, and so I just took more classes in there. And I think maps are really special because you can only say so much with words, but when you can see something laid out spatially, it tells a larger story. And so I love that with GIS, you can show things at different scales, you can show things interact with each other spatially, and it just gives a broader picture. And so I just fell in love with that instantly. And in the last 2 years, particularly, spent my time really honing in that skill.
I was muted, sorry about that. Wonderful job, Cam, and thank you both, Charisma and Maggie, for coming and supporting Cam. And we're very happy that you're staying at Berkeley. Go Bears.
Go Bears.
And I am with you, Maggie. I see people. I'm like, people, and nice people. You know, this is a selective group that comes to the Honor Symposium, even nicer. So I'm going to ask if please, Catherine Stanton, you're up, and we would love to hear your work. And you have the floor if you want to share your slides.
Thank you. Okay, let me just get it set up. Okay, so hello and good afternoon. My name is Catherine Stanton, and my research topic was on slow fashion, extending the life of apparel products, and encouraging circularity through textile choice. And I would first like to thank Professor Dara Rourke for being my advisor my first semester, and for Professor Ignacio Chapella for being my advisor this semester. Their mentorship means a great deal to me, and I'm very grateful for the insight they've been able to provide. So to begin, to understand slow fashion, there needs to be an understanding of sustainable fashion in general. And this is something that the industry lacks, as there's yet to be a clear definition of what sustainable fashion looks like. However, Green Strategy has established one definition that, for the sake of my research, I utilized, and this is being clothing, shoes, and accessories that are manufactured, marketed, and used in the most sustainable manner possible, taking into account both environmental and socioeconomic aspects. What I wanted to investigate is how we can utilize the tenets of sustainable fashion to tackle textile waste and other issues within the industry, but specifically using the concepts of longevity and circularity to accomplish this. What I realized right from the start was the amount of consumer influence that was tied into these issues, and mainly due to current purchasing decisions. Whether we realize it or not, consumers have a great deal of power and have shifted the apparel industry from a previous product-driven chain to a buyer-driven chain, essentially allowing us to decide the trends and leave them to playing catch up. This in turn is what has led us to what is known as just-in-time and quick response manufacturing. And we see this typically as fast fashion brands attempt to replicate what has now been decided as the trendiest item. However, there's hope that our consumer influence can be used to our advantage as we become more educated and aware of the consequences of our actions. To move on, fast fashion, as previously mentioned, is essentially a business model dependent on creating the most profit for the industry with little to no regard for workers or the environment at any stage of production. And we see this as it's a system that relies on quick response times, frequent product assortments, a short product life cycle, and focusing on only current market trends. Slow fashion, on the other hand, is a direct response against this, pushed forward by both consumers, designers, and companies hoping to seek and create items with minimal harm. This model pushes forward the use of organic materials, recycled materials, the purchasing of old, used, and/or vintage garments, and consumer behavior that extends the life of a product, such as repair or regifting. And this directly leads us into how we can encourage circularity and longevity within the system and establish them as essential characteristics for production. In order to do so, the role of designers is key, as they are the decision makers of the initial phase of production and have a say as to what textile will be utilized throughout the supply chain to some extent. However, a stakeholder approach and partnership is still incredibly necessary for this work and to transform the linear model into a circular one. Circularity within the fashion industry utilizes all 4 of the slow fashion characteristics to succeed. And ideally, we would get to a stage where recycling apparel products is a standard instead of ending up directly in the landfill. But designing with circularity in mind can make the biggest impact, as this is the stage where 80% of products' environmental impact is determined. Additionally, longevity. There's 2 types of durability that it's dependent on, and this is physical and emotional durability. And some may not realize this, but they are both equally of importance, specifically as unwanted yet serviceable goods will still potentially be discarded. And currently, physical durability is decreased due to the quick turnaround that we see, along with bad craftsmanship. But by investing in good materials and slowing down production times, it's possible to work against this fairly easily. As for emotional durability, it's necessary to engage with the consumer again in the design process, either via some form of customization or decision making, in order to form these intimate connections that lead one to holding onto items longer. It should go also without saying that textiles have a multitude of impacts on the environment, some of them being listed down below. However, most prominently tying into longevity and circularity are the issues of sourcing and waste. Currently, an estimated $192 million worth of clothing are thrown away each year, causing 92 million tons of textile waste. And this is due to the fact that our most conventional materials are polyester, leather, nylon, acrylic, and cotton. And a majority of these are non-biodegradable. Not to mention that synthetic fibers, being polyester, nylon, and acrylic, are man-made and formed out of non-renewable fossil fuels, such as petroleum. Surprisingly, they can present some benefit as we know the most about their life cycles, and this gives us the opportunity to look for improvements within them, but this is very little in comparison to the damage that they create. As for our sustainable materials, these being the materials the industry should be utilizing across the board, they are either recycled or grown and made responsibly, and they're going to follow one of the 4 categories listed on the screen. Cellulosic, referring to those made out of plant fibers, protein, being sourced from animals, regenerated, which is either going to be from previous cellulosic or protein sources, and then recycled, which is directly made out of old textiles or potentially plastic. For more specific examples, we have cotton, either organic or recycled, unfortunately not the conventional cotton. Wool and hemp, linen, among others, fall into these categories. And one characteristic that makes these sustainable is their ability to biodegrade and actively work against textile waste issues. Synthetic fibers, although their sourcing is unsustainable, if properly recycled, have the potential to outweigh their harms to a certain extent. As the most sustainable materials are the ones that already exist and do not require any further energy or water use for their sourcing. And recycling and reprocessing work directly towards the goal of a zero waste or circular economy within the apparel industry. And that brings us to our next section, which is the role of textiles relating to longevity and circularity. For both of these concepts, an analysis of the textile cycle is required in assessing whether they fall into biological or technical cycles. Biological cycles follow the principles of biomimicry and nature as a manner of regeneration. Technical cycles rely on products retaining their value and quality even through varying levels of use. And both of these cycles have the potential to work within circularity. However, arguably, the most sustainable choice of textiles would be those that are organic and biodegradable, essentially those natural fibers as opposed to any man-made ones, as these lend themselves to a circular model due to the fact that they have a biological compatibility with nature. This is in part is what is necessary to improve and expand slow fashion overall to a larger scale. But there are also additional things that we can apply. And these are things such as addressing and fixing consumer behavior, having companies and designers emphasizing a holistic approach and view of the supply chain, establishing solid and agreed upon sustainability indicators, not just by one industry, but by both, and establishing strong partnerships among both industries with other goals, and allowing brands and designers to have the ability to determine trends. And hopefully this will all allow us to lessen fashion seasons and overproduction overall. And these are in part some recommendations, but others include the transition to a product-driven chain instead of a buyer, embracing the power of consumer influence, but to the advantage of sustainability, and pushing for corporate social responsibility within these brands, making it a joint effort between brands and consumers, encouraging consumers to treat clothing as an investment, and finally, investing in proper infrastructure to allow for sustainable progress, such as recycling on a larger scale, which currently doesn't exist to the point that it needs to. And in conclusion, it's important to remember that textile waste is a result of both bad consumer behavior, but more importantly, a design flaw and a fault of the system. The role of designers is key to progress, and so is their choice of textiles and how it establishes its ability to be recycled or mended. And above all else, the concept of longevity and circularity are interconnected and necessary tenets to create a new, sustainable, and slow fashion future. Finally, I do want to give last thanks to both of my mentors this year and to the CNR Honors Department. Working on this project has been very hard, but also very fun. And I'm extremely grateful for everyone who has contributed to it. Thank you so much.
Very, very well done. Congratulations, Catherine, on honors from CNR. I have a question that was asked by Charisma. She had to leave. Great work, Catherine. I am so sorry that I have to go to another meeting, but I wanted to ask you to expand on the social issues you found in your research, especially on the production side: labor, lack of regulation, unsafe working conditions, price and race to the bottom. Again, great presentation. And then I also have a question.
Yeah, definitely within sustainable fashion, there are so many social factors to take into consideration. Unfortunately, due to the scope of my research, I definitely just focused on the environmental side of that. But as I was creating my research proposal, that was something that I took into consideration because, you know, there are so many tragic examples, such as like Rana Plaza, that, you know, real people are being hurt, you know, workers in factories are being hurt. However, that just wasn't something that I was taking into consideration in terms of textiles.
The question I wanted to, or not a question, but I gave you a reference of a very interesting study, experimental study, where a group of researchers introduced a label on working conditions in the apparel industry and wanted to measure stated, but also then they actually see what people do when they vote with their feet through their purchases when they are presented with these information changes. And I give you the link. It's a really interesting study that you may want to find also relevant. And our Haas School of Business Dean, Ann Harrison, has also an established work on sweatshops and how firms react to a bunch of mechanisms through information or other trade pressures on their practices of labor conditions. Just some suggestions for you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sophia.
Again, well done. And if anyone has any questions, feel free. We have 1 minute for Catherine, and then we'll turn it over to Matt to close that day. Was the term, actually, I'm very curious, was the term preceded the food, or was it the fashion that preceded? Slow food, slow fashion?
You know, I'm not entirely sure. I
was just like, it's around the same theme, right?
Yeah, it's definitely around the same theme. I would probably honestly guess that food probably came first, just because I think slow fashion in general is more of a more recent trend or concept, but I'm not entirely sure.
Well, thank you. Bye, Ariel. And Matt, if you want to share your screen, you have your advisor in the house. So thank you for joining us, Ted. And if you want to show your, yay, we can, just because you did this, Ted, you're going to get a screenshot by email. You know me so well. All right, Matt, you have the floor.
All right. Oh, wait, that's might be, sorry. Should be this one.
We're running early, so you don't.
For some reason, it's doing the wrong. Can you see it or?
So what we see is a purple thing, but not in presentation mode.
Okay. Okay, here we go. So I thought it was on the other window with many tabs. All right, so my presentation is about cobalt mining in the DRC. The title, How Cobalt Mining in the DRC is Neocolonialism in the Name of Decarbonization and Digitalization, and how neoliberal interventions will exacerbate this situation. Before I get started, I really want to give a big thanks to Professor Miguel and Professor Villalobos for sponsoring and serving as research mentors on this project. It's been a long journey and I've really learned a lot about what's going on. Okay, so a primer before I get started, just so everyone kind of understands some of the jargon that I use. Artisanal mining is a form of subsistence mining carried out by individuals or small groups not officially employed by a mining company. Usually they have very rudimentary equipment and do it by hands. Among the global South, artisanal mining is a very common subsistence livelihood. And then on the other hand, there's large scale mining that also exists in the region right now, which is mining companies that we generally associate with mining products. They're very capital intensive. They're usually open pit, meaning that they remove a layer from the top of the ground. And they're almost always run by incredibly wealthy multinational organizations. The region that I study in this paper is specifically Katanga. It's the southern subregion in the DRC. In 2015, it was split into 4 different provinces, but for the sake of continuity, I just refer to the entire subregion as Katanga. However, if we want to get more specific about it, currently most of the mining operations that are taking place are in the very southern portion in Hot Katanga and Lualaba. But there's also the Hot Lamani and Tanganyika districts that have other mining operations as well as more agriculture economies. And so while I jump in, I had in my paper, I had three separate sections. I do an extensive historical review, and then I talk specifically about the 2002 mining code and the failures that the mining code and neoliberal policy has created in the region and in the country as a whole. And then I talk about these corporate dominated reforms. So the reason why I had a historical review was that international corporatism, whether it be colonial or through multi-party investors, they've always had a special interest to keep profits extracted from Katangan subsoil. So when we examine certain policy solutions, we should be able to adopt a more skeptical review amongst corporations' auspicious motives to solve the quote unquote poverty, to solve the poverty problem in the region. And so the second reason why I wanted to include it was that also developmentalism in neoliberal contexts, this has been seen in many other countries within the global South. They often provide very technocratic solutions to try to create inclusive labor markets that are generally ahistorical and apolitical. And so therefore, because they assume that they're operating in a vacuum, they don't, the policies often fail. I want to also just state that it's a grave miscarriage of justice to try to fit a 100-year history into a sub 5-minute section of the presentation. So instead of going through line by line and trying to cover everything at light speed, I've prepared 5 takeaways that are important to keep in mind from the history. So the first takeaway is that mining started in Katanga, specifically with the creation of the corporation Union Minerais, which was a multi-party stakeholder Belgian group that slowly implemented inclusive labor practices and social domination out of necessity in the mid-1920s. This created both level of sympathies with the colonial regime and only specifically Katanga, and also increased production of the UMHK into an international copper producing powerhouse at the time. So my second takeaway is that Katanga's attempted secession in 1960 and 1963 happened right as independence was happening. This was because there was a clear necessity for the UMHK to hold on to its colonial asset. And so therefore they tried to leverage their influence by also pairing with colonial sympathizers who were trying to reunite the Lundan Empire, and basically created a really terrible crisis throughout the 1960s through 1965. The US is also implicated in this time with McCarthyism, basically murdering the first president, and then eventually installing Mobutu, because the US also had this basically proxy war happening at the same time in the Congo crisis to take over power of specifically the mining industry in the region. So the third point is that Mobutu nationalized the UMHK and turned it into Geka mines, but he wasn't a state communist, he was more state capitalist. He still allowed for an investment, especially US influence and help to develop mining sites. And what is usually lost in history is that Mobutu also was Mobutu actually was a strong nation builder for about 10 years. We saw there was 6% growth in the entire nation as he continued to develop Geka mines and Katanga. However, he also underdeveloped nationwide agriculture, national infrastructure. This lopsided economic spending on the economy would slowly prove to be its demise, because in the 1970s, the global recession that started with the oil crisis and the collapse of copper prices really hit the DRC hard. The country was dependent on copper revenue and imported most of their other goods. And so as the country was falling apart, Mobutu was also leveraging that to strengthen his political connections. He becomes despotic in power. He basically he embezzles major funds from the World Bank, and the World Bank in the US, when they give these commercial loans, they don't really care that the debt burden is on the people. It's really just so that the strategic value of the minerals doesn't fall into Soviet hands, which is what they were really afraid of for a really long time until the Soviet Union collapses. And then when the Soviet Union collapses in the early 90s, the US basically cuts off all interaction with the DRC. The state is experiencing massive collapse at this time. And so the fifth takeaway from this is that Mobutu took advantage of the economic collapse and promoted ethnic division in Katanga against Kaijins who also were recruited in the UMHK days to come work at Geka mines, and basically use that as leverage against his political opponent Etienne Tshisekedi, and committed it's unknown to the global north that there is this massive genocide in this region, but that it happened. And so anyways, there's another civil war that happens in 98. Laurent Desire Kabila gains power. He partially does this by privatizing mineral assets and selling them to allies in exchange for arms. He comes into power. He's a quote unquote Marxist. which scares the US. However, he's just as despotic in power as Mobutu was. And much to a lot of speculation that still exists today, Laurent Desire Kabila was murdered to a lot of happiness of wealthy Western elites who were looking to further invest in the region. He was replaced by his 29-year-old son, and the World Bank basically approaches this failing sector and talks to them about how, and pushes urgently that we need to privatize the mining industry. And so that leads us to 2002. And so this next section of my presentation, I talk about the 2002 mining code. I talk about three distinct failures, both on the national, on the regional, and towards the specific artisanal mining community. But before I get there, I also want to talk about why cobalt is so important and what we're getting so wrong about it right now. And so we used to only think of the UMHK as a copper producer, but at its height, it was 8%. It contributed to 8% of global copper supply. However, what's more important today is the 65% of cobalt that comes from Katanga. Cobalt was initially used as pigments for catalysts in plastic production and as super alloys for jet engines and also other high temperature things. However, today and rapidly growing, the 62% for battery components actually might be obsolete at this point. It changes on a yearly basis. And so battery demand is growing rapidly. We use cobalt in all of our major batteries. We use it for electric vehicles. We're using it for grid storage for renewable energy. We're using cobalt for laptops and cell phones, and we have been for that period, which also raises a lot of, I think, suspicion from my end that the assassination of Laurent Desire Kabila coincides with the cell phone and laptop boom. That's something that I want to do a lot more research in the future. However, looking forward to battery demand, we have very large expected increases in demand for supply. Sovacool had said that there's a paper said there's 87,000% potential supply increase. Another article states that there might be a 4,500% increase in price itself. Okay, so the 2002 mining code, it was a neoliberal mining reform that basically existed in a vacuum. The reform dismantled Gecko Mines as a state monopoly mining operator and laid off 10,000 employees. Those 10,000 employees were supposed to be remunerated. They weren't. It gave permits to specific mining concessions granted by the Ministry of Mines off technical criteria, off of technical criteria. I'll talk about that more later. It establishes ZEAs, which were artisanal mining places that, artisanal mining could take place there. They legalized that. And then it also established a royalty system for concessions that mining companies would have to pay the state. All right, first mining code failure. Financial corruption of large scale mines is rampant in the DRC, as one, may cynically expect. Gecko Mines very early in the process took the role of Ministry of Mines because they held all the exploitation permits at the time, all the best ones, and basically gave those permits in these backdoor deals. The CEO of Gecko Mines, who's still the CEO now, but hopefully will be removed soon, would only answer to the president. And so through multiple embezzlement, there's been kickbacks, there's even been with Glencore, which is probably the worst of the worst. They also became a mining concession seller in the DRC because Gecko Mines would give them permits and then they would give them again. Over this entire course, Joseph Kabila's net worth now is like $2 billion. Money is continually missing through state revenue coffers. Failure number two, talks about on the regional level, there is numerous environmental environmental health externalities, as well as a complete disregard for communities surrounding mining sites. There's dangerous pollutions in lifeline rivers. For example, the Base Condo, the hunting preserve, it was established in 1957. There's now a mine and a refinery on the protected hunting reserve, violating national law. These impact local waterways that are lifeline for everything needed from agriculture to drinking to washing. On top of all this, those who live near either transportation roadways or sites experience massive amount of air and noise pollution. There are some studies that are, looking at the level of lung disease in and around mines, as well as radiation poisoning, because Katanga has high uranium reserves that are being upended. The worst part about this entire portion is that there's massive community upheaval. Mining companies come in, they don't really do any due diligence. They remove the state basically removes these towns and puts them in places with non-arable land, and they are either not compensated or severely undercompensated. They have no agency in this program. And on top of this, there's like a 0.3% corporate social responsibility that large scale mines are supposed to participate in. Of course, they don't do that on top of everything else.
Matt, could you please summarize the third failure briefly and then try to conclude? We're just running a little bit over time. Thank you so much. I know it's really unfair to summarize all of this in 10 minutes.
I'm all over the place. Okay, so the third failure basically is that the artisanal mining supply chain is fully exploitative in every sense of the way, in every sense you can imagine. There's no social programs for them. The ZEAs that were produced are too small. People always talk, there's child labor present, and just rampant systemic poverty in the area. Okay, so I'll quickly go over my kind of, just being upset about these corporate dominated reforms. The main one that's gaining a lot of traction is, quote, cleaning up the supply chain. NGOs have done a good job reporting on the conditions that are happening. However, their calls for change are always, let's bring Apple, let's bring Huawei, let's bring Daimler into this conversation to do due diligence and make sure that these mining supply chains are sustainable. However, sustainability really is going to come down to what they decide is can and can't pass while the demand is still so high for cobalt. On top of this, there are numerous anecdotal evidence that talks about the contradictory nature of downstream efforts. Samsung SDI had one of the best ratings for supply chain due diligence, but at the same time, they're buying tons and tons and tons of cobalt from Glencore, which is the worst offender. The second portion of corporate dominated reforms talks to supply chain transformations and the leverage that downstream companies have. The price of cobalt is demand oriented and not necessarily deflation of price, but price shocks leading from specific policy changes, and also innovation could create supply chain shocks that will be felt downstream. There's evidence that very similar things that have been done in the north-south Kivu provinces, as well as Tanganyika with the 3TG and Obama's Dodd-Frank law, had really negative effects on artisanal mining in the region. The recycling and circular economy is somewhat of a more long-term worry that has ostensible good benefits to it, but also has a lot of negative, also could do a lot of damage. In terms of basically closing the cycle without any form of new policy intervention for artisanal miners. It's not necessarily about having, having cobalt that is, conflict free, but rather developing the region around it so that there isn't conflict to begin with. And so then the potential hope is that the first democratic election, actually since 1960 happened in 2018, electing Felix Tshisekedi. I have high hopes for him. He enacted Kabila's outgoing mining code reform, which moved up to a 10% royalty on cobalt concessions. He is creating agencies that will buy artisanal cobalt as a monopoly, and he's slowly weeding out Kabila's network of power. We're hoping that Albert Yuma will be the next, the head of Gecko Mines will be the next to go. And so going forward, industry nationalization, I believe in the formalization of that industry should be the goal. I think that the neoliberal intervention into Katanga was one sought on opportunity for this new digital and decarbonization revolution that we have going on. And over the course of the next 20 years, over the course of 20 years, large-scale mines have repeatedly abused the mining code with no recourse. They should have to pay for the crimes against humanity that they have committed. Thank you so much, Ted, for everything that you've done. I really couldn't have gone this far without you. And thank you so much, Sophia, as well. Also, congrats to everyone in honors. This has been a really amazing day listening to all your presentations.
Thank you. You spoke so long and eloquently that we have no time for questions to keep it with time. So if anyone has questions, Matt Arena at Berkeley, if you just start typing, his email will be there. I give the floor to Anna.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. And then thank you again to Ellen for being one of our judges. And and then also Layla from this morning, who's not here, but thank you to her. And thank you so much for Sophia, who's also been judging all of you as we're going along and helping keep track of the time, asking you great questions. Thank you so much for that. Once again, we're going to be coming back tomorrow for the biological sciences. So that will be kicking off around 8:45 tomorrow. So if you want to see that, that'll be another full day of a second symposium. But congratulations to all the people who went today. I think there's still a number of you here. So congratulations on finishing your presentations today. And also congratulations to those of you who are graduating, which I know is many of you who will be graduating in the next few, either this spring or in the summer. So congratulations on that. We really appreciated your research and hearing all about it today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Great presentations, everyone. Congratulations.